The gas lamp flickered once, then surrendered to the murk. Somewhere in the blind grey mass that swallowed Whitechapel, a woman's footsteps quickened against wet stone. The fog had risen from the Thames an hour past midnight, rolling through the crooked lanes like the breath of something patient, something waiting. It pressed against the windows of doss houses. It muffled the cry of the night soil men. It turned every alley into a corridor without end, every doorway into a wound in the dark. And in that terrible stillness a shape moved. No witness could say from where he came. No constable's lantern could pierce the veil that wrapped the streets in damp silence. The fog did not merely obscure, it conspired. It softened the sound of boots on cobblestone. It swallowed screams before they reached the second syllable. In the autumn of 1888, the East End of London became a stage for slaughter, and the weather itself stood guard over the killer. By morning, the mist would thin, the body would be found, and the man who had done this would be nowhere at all, dissolved into the grey like a rumour, like a ghost, like smoke. Chapter 1. The City That Breathed Smoke. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The hour has grown late, and the world beyond your window has fallen into its own quiet darkness. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whether in a room lit by the pale glow of a screen or lying still beneath the weight of blankets, you have found your way here, and here we shall stay together for a time. Tell me, if you will, where in the world you rest your head this evening. What hour has the clock struck in your corner of the earth? The night is long, and there is no need to rush. If you have not yet done so, consider joining this strange fellowship of listeners who gather here in the dark. A small gesture, a subscription, a moment taken to acknowledge that these whispered histories have found you. It helps this humble channel to grow, to reach others who lie awake and wonder about the shadows of the past. And now, let the modern world fall away. Let the hum of electricity fade. Let us drift backward through the years, through the decades, through the fog of more than a century, until we find ourselves standing in a city that no longer exists, a city of gaslight and soot, of empire and poverty, of silence and screams. Let us go to London. Let us go to the autumn of 1888. The London of that age was not a city one could see clearly even on the finest day. It hung perpetually beneath a veil of its own making, a shroud woven from the exhalations of 10,000 chimneys, from the smoke of factories that lined the riverbanks, from the coal fires that burned in every hearth from Mayfair to Mile End. This was not fog as the countryside knew it, not the gentle white mist that rolled across meadows at dawn and vanished with the sun. This was something else entirely. This was a fog born of industry, thick with particles of sight and sulphur, yellow at its edges and black at its heart. The people of London had a name for it. They called it a pea super for its colour and its density, for the way it seemed to coat the tongue and fill the lungs with something almost tangible. To walk through it was to feel the city pressing against the skin, entering the body with every breath. The source of this darkness was coal. The British Empire ran on coal as surely as it ran on tea and conquest. Every locomotive that pulled goods from the northern mills to the southern ports burned coal. Every steamship that carried soldiers and merchants to the far corners of the world burned coal. Every forge, every foundry, every brewery and bakery and gasworks burned coal. And in the homes of London, from the grandest townhouse to the meanest cellar dwelling, coal fires blazed through the autumn and winter months, sending their smoke upward into a sky that could no longer absorb it. The smoke had nowhere to go. It hung above the rooftops, mingled with the moisture rising from the Thames, and descended again as fog, fog that tasted of ash, fog that stung the eyes, fog that killed the weak and the elderly in their beds. The physicians of the day understood, in their limited fashion, that the fog was dangerous. They called the winter ailments it produced by various names: bronchitis, pneumonia, consumption, and they advised those who could afford to leave the city during the worst months to do so. But for the poor, for the thousands upon thousands who crowded into the tenements and lodging houses of the East End, there was no escape. They breathed the fog because they had no choice. They walked through it to their labours and walked home through it again. They slept in rooms where the fog seeped through cracks in the window frames and settled upon their blankets like a second skin. The fog was not a visitor to their lives. It was a resident. In the autumn months, the fog came most frequently and lingered most stubbornly. The days shortened. The sun, when it appeared at all, was a pale disk barely visible through the haze, casting no warmth and little light. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the streets required gaslight to navigate, and by 6 o'clock the lamps themselves were reduced to faint halos in the murk. A man standing beneath one lamp could not see the next lamp down the street. He walked in a tunnel of dim yellow glow, surrounded on all sides by a darkness that seemed almost solid. Sounds behaved strangely in this darkness. Footsteps echoed from no discernible direction. Voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A carriage could pass within 10 feet of a pedestrian and be heard but never seen, its wheels grinding on the cobblestones like the growl of some unseen beast. The gas lamps themselves were part of the problem. They burned coal gas derived from the same black rock that heated the homes and powered the factories. Their flames added their own contribution to the pall that hung over the city, their own small measure of smoke and soot. The lamplighters made their rounds each evening, climbing their ladders and opening the valves, bringing a pale and sickly illumination to streets that would otherwise have been utterly black. But their work was a losing battle against the fog. On the worst nights, the flames guttered and dimmed as though the very air could not sustain them. On the worst nights, London became a city of the blind. The wealthy had their defences. They had thick curtains to block the fog from their drawing rooms. They had servants to light additional lamps and tend larger fires. They had carriages with enclosed cabins, link boys with torches to run ahead and guide the horses. When the fog grew truly impenetrable, they simply stayed indoors, conducting their business by letter and receiving visitors in parlours that glowed with candlelight. The fog was an inconvenience to them, a topic of conversation, a reason to complain about the filthy state of modern industry. It did not threaten their lives in any immediate way. It did not force them into the streets at hours when no respectable person should be abroad. But the poor had no such luxuries. The poor worked at all hours, in all conditions. The dock workers unloaded ships in fog so thick they could not see the cargo they carried. The costermongers pushed their barrows through streets they navigated by memory and by touch. The women of Whitechapel, those women whom history would remember only in death, walked the pavements in search of 4p for a bed, a few coins earned in darkness that offered both opportunity and peril. The fog was their workplace. The fog was their hunting ground. And the fog, as autumn deepened into the terrible months of 1888, would become their grave. The streets of the East End were ill-suited to navigation even in clear weather. They had grown organically over centuries, following the paths of ancient lanes and the boundaries of long-forgotten estates. They doubled back upon themselves. They narrowed without warning into passages barely wide enough for a single person to pass. They opened into courts and yards accessible only through archways that might be missed entirely by anyone unfamiliar with the neighbourhood. The names alone suggested the labyrinth: Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, Burner Street, Mitre Square, Dorset Street, Flower and Dean Street, Thrall Street, Fashion Street. These were not the broad avenues of the West End, designed for carriages and comets. These were warrens, dense with humanity, dark even at midday, and when the fog descended they became something close to impassable. A constable walking his beat in Whitechapel on a foggy night moved slowly, uncertainly, his bull's-eye lantern held before him like a talisman against the dark. The beam it cast was narrow and weak, swallowed by the murk within a few feet. He could see the ground directly before his boots, He could see, if he held the lantern high, the nearest wall or doorway. Beyond that, nothing. His ears became his primary sense, straining for sounds of disturbance, a cry, a scuffle, the clatter of running feet. But the fog muffled sound as surely as it blocked light. A woman could scream in an alley, and a constable 30 yards away might hear nothing but a faint and directionless murmur. A man could commit murder in a courtyard, and the witness in the room above might see only grey shapes moving through grey air, formless and unidentifiable. This was the city into which the Ripper came. This was the stage upon which he performed his horrors. He did not create the fog, but he used it as surely as he used his knife. He understood, whether by instinct or by calculation, that the weather was his ally. The autumn of 1888 would bring fog after fog, night after night of impenetrable darkness, and in that darkness he would move with a freedom that no amount of police patrols could curtail. The city itself protected him. The city itself was his accomplice. The coal smoke hung in the air. The gas lamps flickered and failed. The Thames breathed its grey exhalation into the streets of the East End. And somewhere in that choking darkness, a figure waited, patient, purposeful, invisible. The fog asked no questions. The fog told no tales. The fog simply descended, as it had descended for decades, and wrapped London in its cold embrace. And beneath that embrace, in the narrow streets where the poor lived and died unnoticed, the autumn of terror began. The candles in the windows of Whitechapel burned low. The public houses emptied their last customers into the murk. The women who worked the streets pulled their shawls tighter against the damp and peered into the darkness for the shapes of men who might offer a few coins. They could not know what waited for them. They could not know that the fog which made their work possible also made their deaths inevitable. They walked forward into the grey, one step at a time, and the grey closed behind them like water. Chapter 2. The Geometry of Darkness. To understand how a man could kill and vanish within moments, one must first understand the place where the killing happened. Whitechapel was not a neighbourhood in any modern sense of the word. It was an accumulation of centuries, a place where streets had been laid down upon older streets, where buildings had risen and risen again in different configurations, where the original logic of the land had long since been buried beneath layers of human desperation. The Romans had walked here once. The medieval merchants had built their first timber houses along these routes, and generation after generation had added to the confusion, carving out courts and alleys, subdividing buildings into ever smaller dwellings, creating a maze that seemed designed by no single mind but by the collective pressure of too many bodies in too little space. The streets of the East End did not run straight. They curved and doubled back. They narrowed without warning from thoroughfares wide enough for cart traffic into passages where two people could not walk abreast. They opened suddenly into courtyards surrounded on all sides by high walls, accessible only through archways that might be locked at night or might stand open to anyone who knew they were there. A stranger to Whitechapel could become lost within 100 yards of the main road. A resident of Whitechapel could disappear into the Warren and emerge 3 streets away without ever having been seen by anyone who might later serve as witness. The courts were the most dangerous places. They bore names that appeared on no official map, names known only to those who lived there or who conducted business there that preferred not to be observed. Miller's Court, Dutfield's Yard. These were not streets but enclosures, surrounded by the rear walls of buildings that faced outward onto more respectable lanes. To enter them, one passed through a narrow passage, often no more than 3 feet wide, often unlit, often so dark that even at midday one walked by touch rather than sight. What happened within these courts was hidden from the world. The residents knew this, the criminals knew this, and in the autumn of 1888, the killer knew this too. The buildings themselves contributed to the darkness. They had been constructed without regard to light or air, built as cheaply as possible to house as many tenants as possible, their windows small and often broken, their walls black with the accumulated soot of decades. They leaned against one another like drunken companions, their upper stories jutting out over the streets below and blocking whatever feeble light might otherwise have reached the pavement. In some places, the buildings on opposite sides of a lane nearly touched at their rooftops, creating tunnels of permanent shadow even when the sun stood directly overhead. When the fog came, these tunnels became voids, spaces of absolute darkness where a man could stand an arm's length from another man and remain entirely unseen. The lodging houses added another layer of complexity to the geography of concealment. Whitechapel contained hundreds of them, common lodging houses where the desperate could purchase a bed for 4p a night, or a share of a bed for less. They bore names like Crossingham's and McCarthy's, and they operated under only the loosest supervision from the authorities. A man could enter such a house, pay his 4p, and sleep among dozens of strangers without ever giving his name. He could leave before dawn and be remembered by no one. The deputy who collected the money saw hundreds of faces each week, thousands each month. The residents came and went at all hours, slipping in and out of doors that opened onto back courts and side passages. A man with blood on his hands could walk into a lodging house, wash at the common basin, change his clothes if he had others, and walk out again into the fog without attracting the slightest notice. The police understood the difficulty of their position. They had mapped Whitechapel as best they could, dividing it into beats that constables walked at regular intervals throughout the night. But the maps were inadequate to the reality. Constable might know the main streets of his beat well enough, but the courts and passages that branched off from those streets were too numerous to memorize, too changeable to rely upon. Buildings were torn down and new ones erected. Passages that had been open last month might be blocked this month. A constable following the sound of a disturbance might find himself in a dead end, might find the way he had come somehow changed in the darkness, might spend precious minutes finding his way back to a route he knew while the criminal he sought put distance between them with every passing second. The darkness of Whitechapel was not merely an absence of light, it was a presence, a physical thing that resisted penetration. The buildings blocked the moonlight, the fog blocked the starlight, the gas lamps, where they existed at all, were too few and too feeble to do more than create small islands of visibility in an ocean of black. A woman walking home from a public house might pass through 3 or 4 of these islands in the course of a single street, plunging into darkness between each one, emerging briefly into the light, then descending again into the murk. Anyone following her need only wait in the darkness between the lamps. Anyone watching her need only stand still and let the shadows do the rest. The residents of Whitechapel had adapted to this environment as best they could. They knew which routes were safer than others. They knew which courts to avoid after dark. They knew the sounds of the neighbourhood, the particular creak of a specific door, the distinctive footfall of a familiar neighbour, and they listened for anomalies. But their adaptations were imperfect. They were poor, and poverty imposed its own demands. A woman who needed 4p for a bed could not choose to stay indoors when the streets were dangerous. A man who worked the night shift at the docks could not choose to travel only by daylight. They moved through the darkness because they had no alternative, and they trusted to luck, to familiarity, to the simple mathematics of probability that suggested most nights would pass without incident. The killer exploited every advantage the geography offered. He chose his locations with care, selecting spots where the darkness was deepest, where the passages offered multiple routes of escape, where the noise of the surrounding streets would cover any sounds of struggle. He struck quickly and withdrew before the body could be discovered. He knew, or learned, that the courts and alleys of Whitechapel were as close to invisibility as any place in the modern world could offer. A man could commit murder in Mitre Square and be gone before the constable completed his 15-minute circuit. A man could kill in Dutfield's yard and slip through the side passage into the confusion of Berner Street, while the witnesses were still trying to understand what they had heard. The geometry of Whitechapel was a geometry of concealment, a fragmentation of blind corners and dead ends. It was a place built for secrets, where privacy and danger were two aspects of the same darkness. The respectable citizens of London rarely ventured there. The police who patrolled there did so with the knowledge that they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the very streets they walked. And somewhere in those streets, in the autumn of 1888, a killer moved with confidence born of understanding. He knew this place. He knew its shadows. He knew that the darkness would keep his secrets as surely as the grave. The fog descended upon this labyrinth like a second layer of blindness. What had been difficult to navigate became impossible. What had been dark became absolute. The streets that residents knew by memory became strange and unfamiliar, their landmarks erased by the grey. And in that double darkness, the killer found conditions perfectly suited to his purpose. He could move without being seen. He could strike without being heard. He could vanish without leaving a trace. The geometry of Whitechapel had always been dangerous. The fog made it lethal. The night closed in upon the East End. The passages filled with shadow. The courts retreated into their isolation. And somewhere in that maze of stone and soot, the killer waited for his moment. Patient, invisible, perfectly hidden in a place that had been hiding secrets since before his grandfather was born. Chapter 3. The River's Breath. The Thames had flowed through London since before London existed, since before the Romans built their bridge and their walls, since the ancient Britons paddled their coracles through marshes that would one day become the greatest city in the world. It was the reason London existed at all. A highway of commerce, a source of water, a boundary and a lifeline both. But by the autumn of 1888, the river had become something else as well. It had become a source of the fog that blanketed the city, a contributor to the darkness that settled upon Whitechapel like a curse. The mechanism was simple enough for the natural philosophers of the day to understand, though they were powerless to prevent it. Water evaporated from the surface of the Thames throughout the day and night, rising as invisible vapour into the air above the river. When the temperature dropped, as it did reliably in the autumn evenings, this vapour condensed into mist, tiny droplets of water suspended in the air, drifting on whatever breeze stirred the night. In the countryside, such mist would dissipate with the morning sun, burned away by the warmth of a new day. But in London, the mist had nowhere to go. It mingled with the coal smoke that hung perpetually above the rooftops. It thickened with the particles of soot and ash that every chimney exhaled. It became something denser than ordinary fog, something that clung to surfaces and resisted the feeble rays of the morning sun, something that could persist for days when conditions were right. The East End lay close to the river, close to the docks where the commerce of empire was loaded and unloaded day and night. The great ships came up the Thames from every corner of the world, carrying spices from the Indies, tea from China, wool from Australia, timber from the Baltic. They moored at the wharves, and armies of men swarmed over them, transferring their cargoes to the warehouses that lined the riverbank. The work went on at all hours, in all weather, and the workers breathed the air of the river as they laboured, the damp air, the foggy air, the air that crept up from the water and wrapped itself around their lungs. The river exhaled its mist most heavily in the hours before dawn, when the temperature dropped to its lowest point, and the air could hold no more moisture. This was the hour when the fog was thickest, when the streets of Whitechapel disappeared entirely beneath a grey shroud that seemed almost alive. It was also the hour when the women of the streets were most desperate, when the public houses had closed and the last chance for fourpence was slipping away. They walked the pavements in this pre-dawn fog, searching for any man who might still be abroad, any opportunity to earn the price of a bed before the lodging houses turned them out into the cold. They walked blind, these women, trusting to their feet and their memory of the streets. They could not see who approached them until he was already upon them. They could not flee what they could not perceive. The fog from the river carried its own particular qualities. It smelled of the Thames, of mud and sewage, of rotting vegetation, of the effluvia of industry that poured into the water from 1,000 outlets. It tasted of salt when the tide was high and the sea pushed up river. It coated everything it touched with a thin film of moisture, making the cobblestones slick and treacherous, making the walls of buildings sweat with condensation. Those who breathed it deeply coughed and spat, clearing their throats of the grey matter that seemed to accumulate with every inhalation. Those who spent their lives in it developed the characteristic rasp of the East End voice, the roughened throat of a people who had never known clean air. The constables who patrolled the streets in this river fog found their task nearly impossible. Their bullseye lanterns, designed to cast a focused beam of light upon whatever they wished to examine, became useless instruments. The beam struck the fog and diffused, scattering in all directions, illuminating nothing but the grey itself. A constable might hold his lantern up to read a street sign and find the letters invisible from 5 feet away. He might shine his light down an alley and see nothing but a wall of murk, impenetrable, offering no information about what might lie within. He walked by sound and by touch, counting his steps, knowing from experience how many paces lay between one landmark and the next. He listened for trouble, but the fog from the river muffled sound as effectively as it blocked light. The moisture in the air absorbed vibrations, dampened echoes, turned the streets into silent corridors where footsteps made no noise, and voices died within yards of the mouths that uttered them. The killer understood this silence. He used it. On the nights when the river breathed its heaviest fog, he moved through Whitechapel with impunity, knowing that no cry would carry, no witness could see, no pursuit could find him in the grey. He chose his nights with care, or perhaps he was simply patient, waiting for the conditions that favoured his work. The records of the Metropolitan Police would later note the weather on the nights of the murders, and the pattern was clear enough for anyone who wished to see it. The worst nights, the nights of the canonical 5, the nights when the terror reached its peak, were nights of thick fog, of river mist, of visibility reduced to feet rather than yards. The Thames gave life to London, but it also gave darkness. It gave concealment. It gave the killer his cloak. The water that had nourished the city for 2,000 years now conspired in its murders, breathing out its grey exhalation night after night, wrapping the streets of the East End in a shroud that no lantern could penetrate. The women who died that autumn died in the breath of the river, died in the fog that rose from the water they had known all their lives. The water did not care. The water simply flowed as it had always flowed, carrying the refuse of empire toward the sea. The fog thickened in the early hours of morning. The docks fell silent as the work crews finished their shifts. The public houses locked their doors, and in Whitechapel, in the courts and alleys that lay within walking distance of the river, the mist pressed close against the walls, filling every space, erasing every landmark. Somewhere in that grey silence a man moved with purpose. Somewhere in that grey silence a woman walked unknowing toward her fate. The river breathed, the fog descended, and the night stretched on toward dawn. Chapter 4. The First Blood in the Mist. The last hours of Mary Ann Nichols were hours of fog and desperation. She had been turned away from her lodging at 1:30 in the morning, lacking the 4pence required for a bed. She had laughed, also the deputy would later remember, and told him she would soon have her DOS money, pointing to the bonnet she wore. A new bonnet, a bit of finery that she believed would help her attract a client in the dark streets. She walked out into the night, into the fog that had descended upon Whitechapel, and she did not return. The woman called Polly Nichols had lived 43 years upon the earth. She had been born Mary Ann Walker in the parish of St. Bride, Fleet Street, the daughter of a locksmith. She had married William Nichols in 1864, and she had borne him 5 children before the marriage collapsed in recrimination and alcohol. She had tried the workhouse. She had tried domestic service. She had tried and failed and tried again. and by the summer of 1888 she had descended to the common lodging houses of the East End, earning her bed money in the manner of so many desperate women before her. She was not young. She was not beautiful. She was simply another face in the crowd of the dispossessed, another body moving through the fog in search of survival. The streets she walked that night were familiar to her. She knew the public houses of Whitechapel Road. She knew the corners where women gathered to await potential clients. She knew the courts and alleys where such transactions took place, dark places where fourpence might change hands in exchange for a few minutes of use. She had walked these streets many times before, on nights both clear and foggy, and she had survived. There was no reason to believe this night would be different. There was no warning, no omen, no premonition of the horror that awaited her. She simply walked, as she had always walked, looking for a man with a few coins and a few minutes to spare. The fog was thick that night. The records of the Metropolitan Police would later describe the conditions as poor visibility, a bureaucratic phrase that conveyed nothing of the reality. A woman walking through Bucks Row at 3:30 in the morning could not see the far side of the street. She could not see who approached her from the shadows. She could hear footsteps, perhaps, if the fog had not muffled them entirely. She could see a shape emerging from the grey, a human form becoming visible only when it was already within arm's reach. She could not run from what she could not perceive. She could not scream for help that could not hear her. What happened in Bucks Row in the early hours of August 31st can only be reconstructed from the evidence that remained. Mary Ann Nichols was found lying on her back near a stable gate, her throat cut so deeply that the vertebrae were visible. Her clothing was disarranged, her bonnet knocked from her head, her eyes open and staring at the fog that still hung above her. The wounds to her abdomen would not be discovered until she was taken to the mortuary and her clothing removed. They were wounds of extraordinary violence, wounds that suggested not merely murder, but something darker, something that would come to be recognised as the signature of a killer unlike any London had seen before. The body was discovered by a carman named Charles Cross, who was walking to work at 3:30. He saw what he first took to be a tarpaulin lying in the road, a shapeless dark mass barely visible in the fog. He approached and found that it was a woman, lying with her skirts raised above her waist. He called to another man, Robert Paul, who was walking behind him, and together they attempted to determine whether she was dead or merely unconscious. The fog made their examination difficult. They could not see clearly. They touched her hands and found them cold. They attempted to pull down her skirts to restore her modesty. They did not see the wounds to her throat, for the darkness and the fog concealed them. They went to find a constable, believing they had found a woman who had fainted or been assaulted, and they left the body lying in Bucks Row as the fog swirled around it. Constable John Neal discovered the full horror a few minutes later. He was walking his beat, his lantern held before him, moving slowly through the murk as he had done countless times before. He came upon the body and he shone his light upon it, and he saw what Cross and Paul had not seen. The terrible wound across the throat, the blood that had pooled beneath the body and soaked into the ground. He signalled for assistance with his lantern, waving it in the fog, hoping that another constable might see the signal through the grey. Help came. The body was placed on an ambulance and taken to the mortuary, and it was there, in the cold light of the examination room, that the full extent of the injuries became apparent. The fog had served the killer well. He had approached Mary Ann Nichols in darkness so complete that she could not have seen his face until the moment he seized her. He had killed her in a street where no witness could observe his actions, where the few residents who might have heard something heard only silence, muffled by the river mist that wrapped the East End in its grey embrace. He had walked away through that same fog, invisible, untraceable, leaving behind only a body that would not be found for another hour. The constables who searched Bucks Row and the surrounding streets found nothing. No weapon, no blood-stained clothing, no witness who could describe the killer's appearance or direction of flight. The fog had swallowed all evidence as surely as it had swallowed the killer himself. The inquest into the death of Mary Ann Nichols began on September 1st. The coroner, Wynne Baxter, heard testimony from the carman and the constable, from the lodging house deputy who had turned her away, from the surgeon who had examined her body. The jury rendered a verdict of murder by person, or persons unknown. The newspapers began to take notice. A woman had been killed in Whitechapel, killed with unusual savagery, killed on a night of dense fog that had prevented any identification of her murderer. It was not yet the sensation it would become. It was not yet the terror that would grip the whole of London. But it was a beginning. The fog lifted on the morning after the murder, as fog always lifted, dissolving in the weak sunlight that filtered through the smoke. Bucks Row returned to its ordinary appearance, a narrow lane of warehouses and stables, unremarkable, forgettable. The blood that had soaked into the ground was scrubbed away. The residents went about their business. And in the lodging houses and public houses of Whitechapel, the women who worked the streets spoke of the murder in low voices, wondering who might be next, wondering whether the fog would return. It would return. It would return again and again through the autumn months, and each time it returned, the killer would be waiting. Mary Ann Nichols was the first of the canonical 5, the first victim whose death would be attributed to the man the newspapers would soon call Jack the Ripper. She died in the fog, alone, unseen, her cries unheard by anyone who might have saved her. She died in a darkness so complete that even now, more than a century later, no one can say with certainty who killed her or why. The fog kept its secrets. The fog always kept its secrets. The night closed in upon Whitechapel once more. The gas lamps flickered in the murk, and somewhere in the labyrinth of courts and alleys, a killer considered his next move, knowing that the weather would favour him again, knowing that the darkness was his ally, knowing that the city itself would hide his crimes. Mary Ann Nichols lay in the mortuary waiting for burial. The fog gathered above the Thames, preparing to descend again, and the autumn of terror continued its slow, inexorable progress toward horrors yet to come. Chapter 5. The Killer's Clock. The autumn of 1888 moved according to rhythms that the killer understood. The days shortened with each passing week, stealing minutes from the light and adding them to the darkness. By the end of September, the sun set before 6 o'clock in the evening. By the end of October, true darkness came before 5. The night stretched longer and longer, expanding like a stain across the hours, and with each expansion, the window of opportunity for murder grew wider. The women who worked the streets of Whitechapel operated within their own temporal constraints. They emerged from the lodging houses and public houses in the late evening, when the respectable citizens of London had retired to their homes, and the less respectable had begun their rounds of drinking and entertainment. They walked the pavements through the night, hoping to earn enough for their bed before the lodging houses closed their doors at 2 o'clock in the morning. Those who failed to earn their fourpence by that hour faced a choice: continue walking in search of a late client, or find a doorway or archway where they might sleep rough until morning. Neither option was safe. Both options placed them alone on dark streets at the very hours when the fog was thickest and the constables were fewest. The killer learned these rhythms, or perhaps he already knew them from long observation. He struck in the early morning hours between 1 o'clock and 5 o'clock, when the streets were at their emptiest, and the fog at its most impenetrable. He struck on nights when the weather favoured concealment, nights of thick mist, of river fog, of darkness so complete that a man could pass within feet of a constable and remain unseen. He did not strike randomly. He did not strike impulsively. He struck with a precision that suggested planning, patience, and an intimate knowledge of the environment in which he operated. The pattern would become clear only in retrospect, when investigators and journalists began to compile the dates and times of the murders and search for connections. Mary Ann Nichols died at approximately 3:30 in the morning. Annie Chapman died at approximately 5:30 in the morning. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes died within an hour of each other, between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the morning. Mary Jane Kelly died sometime between 2 o'clock and 10:30 in the morning, though the later estimate was complicated by circumstances unique to her case. The killer worked in the darkest hours. He worked when the fog was thickest. He worked when the streets were empty and the constables were at the furthest points of their beats. The Metropolitan Police patrolled Whitechapel in shifts, with constables walking their assigned beats at regular intervals. A beat might take 15 minutes to complete, or it might take 20, depending on its length and complexity. A constable walking his beat would pass any given point once every 15 to 20 minutes, which meant that a crime committed at that point would have a window of at least 15 minutes before the constable returned. In 15 minutes, a man could commit murder. In 15 minutes, a man could mutilate a body. In 15 minutes, a man could walk far enough from the scene to be invisible by the time the constable arrived. The killer understood this arithmetic. He used it. The fog extended these windows enormously. On clear nights, a constable might see a disturbance from 50 yards away. He might hear a cry and pinpoint its source. He might observe a man fleeing and give chase with some hope of success. But on foggy nights, none of this was possible. A constable might walk past an alley where a murder was in progress and hear nothing, see nothing, continue on his beat unaware that death had occurred within arm's reach. He might arrive at a murder scene and find no witness who could say which direction the killer had fled, because no one had seen the killer at all. He might search the surrounding streets and find only fog, impenetrable and unhelpful, offering no clues and no suspects. The autumn nights also brought cold, and cold brought its own advantages to a man who wished to kill unseen. The residents of Whitechapel stayed indoors when they could, huddled around their fires, unwilling to venture into streets where the damp chill cut through clothing and settled in the bones. The windows that might have looked out upon the streets were shuttered against the cold, their curtains drawn, their inhabitants blind to whatever occurred outside. A scream that might have been heard in summer, when windows stood open and people sat on their doorsteps, was lost in autumn, absorbed by closed doors and drawn curtains and the general withdrawal of humanity from the hostile streets. The killer's clock was set by these convergent factors: the shortening days, the lengthening nights, the thickening fog, the emptying streets, the closing windows. He emerged when conditions were optimal and withdrew when they were not. He may have walked the streets on clear nights as well, observing, learning, waiting for the fog to return. He may have followed women who would later become his victims, noting their habits, their roots, their vulnerabilities. No one can say with certainty what he did in the hours when he was not killing, but the evidence of the killings themselves suggests a man who understood his environment with unusual precision. The autumn also brought particular meteorological conditions that favoured fog formation. The temperature differential between day and night was at its greatest in the autumn months, with warm afternoons giving way to cold evenings. This differential caused rapid condensation of moisture in the air, particularly moisture that had evaporated from the Thames during the warmer hours. The smoke from coal fires, which burned more heavily as the weather cooled, added particulate matter to this moisture, thickening it into the characteristic London fog that could persist for days. September and October of 1888 saw fog after fog, night after night of reduced visibility, and it was in these months that the canonical murders occurred. The police attempted to counteract the killer's advantages by increasing patrols. After the murder of Annie Chapman on September 8th, the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police both added constables to the Whitechapel beats. Plainclothes detectives were deployed to walk the streets in civilian attire, hoping to spot suspicious behaviour. Vigilance committees composed of local residents organised their own patrols, carrying lanterns and whistles. But none of these measures could overcome the fundamental problem of the fog. More constables meant nothing if those constables could not see. More lanterns meant nothing if the lantern beams could not penetrate the murk. The killer continued to operate within his chosen hours, and the fog continued to protect him. The The timing of the murders also suggested a man who needed to be somewhere by morning. A man with employment, perhaps, or with domestic obligations that required his presence when the day began. The murders occurred in the hours before dawn, but none occurred after sunrise. The killer completed his work and departed before the light came, before the fog began to thin, before the early risers emerged onto the streets, and the risk of observation increased. This pattern led some investigators to speculate about his occupation. Was he a slaughterman, accustomed to early hours? A coachman, required to have his horses ready by daybreak? A market porter due at Spitalfields or Billingsgate before the morning trade began? The questions multiplied, but the answers remained hidden. The killer's clock ticked through the autumn nights, marking the hours when murder was possible. The women of Whitechapel learned to fear those hours, but they could not avoid them. The desperate mathematics of poverty required them to walk the streets when the streets were most dangerous, to seek clients when clients were scarcest, to venture into the fog when the fog was thickest. They knew the killer was out there, somewhere, waiting. They knew the nights were growing longer and darker. They knew the fog would return. And still they walked, because they had no choice, because fourpence for a bed was fourpence for survival, because the alternative to the streets was the workhouse or starvation or the slow death of cold. The clock struck 2. The lodging houses closed their doors. The women who had not earned their bed money walked on through the fog, hoping, searching, desperate. And somewhere in the darkness the killer checked his own clock, noted the hour and made his move. Chapter 6. The Lantern's Failure. The bullseye lantern was the constable's companion in the dark. It was a simple device, a metal housing containing a candle or oil flame, with a lens at the front that concentrated the light into a directed beam. The constable carried it in his hand or hung it from his belt, and when he needed to examine something in the darkness, he turned the lens toward it and illuminated it as best he could. On clear nights, the bullseye lantern was adequate to its purpose. On foggy nights, it was nearly useless. Light behaves differently in fog than it does in clear air. In clear air, light travels in straight lines from its source to the objects it illuminates, bouncing off surfaces and returning to the observer's eye. The observer sees the object clearly, defined by the light that is reflected from it. But in fog, light encounters obstacles before it reaches the objects the observer wishes to see. The tiny water droplets suspended in the air scatter the light in all directions, diffusing it, spreading it, weakening it. A beam that might travel 50 yards in clear air travels only 5 yards in thick fog before it has been scattered into uselessness. The observer sees not the objects he wishes to examine, but the fog itself, glowing with diffused light, revealing nothing beyond its own grey mass. The constables of Whitechapel understood this limitation intimately. They had walked their beats through countless foggy nights, holding their lanterns before them like talismans, hoping to pierce the murk and failing every time. They learned to compensate as best they could. They held the lantern low, close to the ground, where the fog was sometimes thinner. They held it close to walls and doors, pressing it near the surfaces they wished to examine. They learned to navigate by touch and memory rather than by sight, counting their paces, reaching out for familiar landmarks, trusting their feet to find the path their eyes could not perceive. But these compensations were inadequate to the task of finding a killer. A constable might successfully navigate his beat in the fog, might arrive at each checkpoint on schedule, might complete his rounds without becoming lost. But he could not see what was happening in the courts and alleys that branched off from his route. He could not observe a murder in progress 30 feet from where he stood. He could not spot a man fleeing the scene of a crime unless that man ran directly into the constable's path. The lantern that served well enough for routine patrol became worthless for detection and pursuit. The morning after the murder of Annie Chapman, the police attempted to reconstruct what had happened in the yard behind 29 Hanbury Street. The body had been found at 6 o'clock by John Davis, a resident of the house, who had gone down to the yard to use the privy. Chapman lay on her back near the fence, her throat cut, her abdomen mutilated, her intestines extracted and placed over her shoulder. The killer had performed these acts in darkness, in a yard accessible through a passage from the street, while residents slept in the rooms above. No one had heard anything. No one had seen anything. The fog had been thick that night, and the lanterns of the constables who patrolled nearby had failed to penetrate it. The failure was not a failure of effort or diligence. The constables had walked their beats. They had passed Hanbury Street at regular intervals. But the passage that led to the rear yard was narrow and dark, and the fog had made it invisible from the street. A constable walking past would have seen nothing but a grey wall of murk where the passage entrance should have been. He would have had no reason to enter, no indication that anything was amiss. He would have continued on his way, checking the doors of shops and warehouses, shining his useless lantern into the useless fog, while behind him, in the yard he could not see, a woman was being murdered. The police experimented with different approaches after the Chapman murder. They tried carrying more powerful lanterns. They tried posting constables at fixed points, rather than having them walk continuous beats, reasoning that a stationary observer might see more than a moving one. They tried coordinating their movements so that multiple constables would converge on the same area at the same time, hoping that 4 or 5 lanterns together might accomplish what one could not. None of these experiments succeeded. The fog defeated them all. The problem was not merely optical, but psychological. A constable walking through thick fog experienced a kind of sensory deprivation that affected his judgment and his confidence. He could not see threats. He could not assess situations. He could not tell whether the sound he heard came from 10 feet away or 50 feet away, from the left or the right, from before him or behind him. He walked in a state of perpetual uncertainty, his nerves stretched tight, his imagination filling the darkness with dangers that might or might not be real. Under these conditions, constables became cautious, hesitant, unwilling to venture into passages and courts where they could not see what awaited them. They stayed on the main streets where the gas lamps provided at least some illumination. They avoided the darkest places, the most dangerous places, the places where the killer did his work. The killer understood this psychology as well as he understood the physics of light and fog. He knew that the constables were afraid. He knew they would not follow him into the deepest darkness. He knew that their lanterns were symbols of authority rather than instruments of detection, that the light they cast was more for the comfort of the constable than for the illumination of the criminal. He operated in the spaces where the lanterns could not reach, the courts and yards and passages where the fog pressed close, and the darkness was absolute. He was safe there. He was invisible there. He could work undisturbed for the 15 or 20 minutes required to commit his crimes, and then he could walk away through the same fog that had protected him, knowing that no constable would see him go. The lanterns continued to bob through the streets of Whitechapel on the foggy nights of that autumn. The constables continued to walk their beats, to check their chronometers, to arrive at their checkpoints on schedule. They were doing their duty as best they could, within the limitations imposed by weather and technology and the geometry of the streets, but their lanterns were failing them. Their light was not enough, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of their beams, the killer continued to operate, protected by the fog, hidden by the night, secure in the knowledge that no lantern could find him. The technology of illumination would improve in the years and decades that followed. Electric lights would replace gas lamps. Portable electric torches would replace bullseye lanterns. The fogs themselves would diminish as London slowly converted from coal to cleaner fuels. But in the autumn of 1888, none of these improvements had arrived. The constables of Whitechapel fought the darkness with inadequate tools, and the darkness won. The fog pressed close against the windows of the police stations. The constables prepared for their shifts, checking their lanterns, filling them with oil, trimming their wicks. They knew the fog was thick tonight. They knew their lanterns would be nearly useless. They went out anyway because duty required it, because the women of Whitechapel deserved whatever protection could be offered, because the alternative was to surrender the streets entirely to the darkness. They walked into the fog, their lanterns held before them, their eyes straining against the grey. And they saw nothing. They saw only the fog itself glowing faintly with their own reflected light, hiding whatever secrets the night contained. Chapter 7. The double event. The night of September 30th began with rain. It fell upon Whitechapel in fitful bursts throughout the evening, clearing the streets of those who had any shelter to seek, driving the women of the neighbourhood into the public houses and lodging-house kitchens where they might wait for the weather to improve. The fog had not yet descended. The gas lamps reflected off wet cobblestones, and in the International Working Men's Educational Club on Berner Street, a group of Jewish socialists concluded their weekly meeting and prepared to go home. Elizabeth Stride had spent the evening in and out of the public houses, as was her custom. She was 44 years old, a Swedish immigrant who had lived in London for more than 2 decades, who had married and been widowed, who had descended through the familiar stages of poverty until she reached the lodging houses of the East End. She was known to her neighbours as Long Liz for her height, and she had a reputation for sobriety that distinguished her from many of the women who walked the same streets. She had been seen with a man at approximately 11 o'clock, and again at 11:30, and again at 1:15. The witnesses disagreed about his appearance. The fog had begun to descend by then, mixing with the lingering rain, and the visibility was poor. Dutefield's yard lay behind the International Working Men's Educational Club, accessible through a narrow passage from Berner Street. It was a working yard used for storage and for the stabling of horses, and at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, Louis Diemschutz drove his costermonger's cart through the passage to stable his pony. The pony shied to the left as it entered the yard, refusing to proceed. Diemschutz prodded it forward, then looked down to see what had startled the animal. He saw a shape on the ground. He lit a match. The match illuminated a woman lying on her side, her throat cut, her blood still flowing into the gutter. The body of Elizabeth Stride was still warm when Diemschutz found her. The blood had not yet congealed. The murder had occurred within minutes of his arrival, perhaps within moments. The killer had been interrupted. He had cut Stride's throat, but he had not performed the mutilations that had characterized the previous murders. He had fled, through the yard, through another passage, into the fog-shrouded streets, leaving behind a woman who was not yet dead when he abandoned her, whose heart may have still been beating as her murderer vanished into the grey. The alarm was raised. Members of the club ran into the streets, blowing whistles, shouting for police. Constables converged on Berner Street from their beats. The fog made coordination difficult. Messages were confused. Time was lost. And while the police gathered around the body of Elizabeth Stride, attempting to secure the scene and search for witnesses, the killer was already moving westward, toward the boundary between the Metropolitan Police District and the City of London Police District, toward a small square called Mitre Square. Catherine Eddowes had been released from Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 o'clock in the morning. She had been arrested earlier in the evening for drunkenness, found lying on the pavement of Aldgate High Street singing to herself. She'd given a false name, Mary Ann Kelly, and had slept off her intoxication in a cell. When she was sober enough to stand, the constable on duty released her, and she walked out into the fog. She was 46 years old. She had lived a life of poverty and intermittent prostitution. She had a common-law husband who would identify her body. She had less than an hour to live. Mitre Square was a small commercial square in the City of London, surrounded by warehouses and counting houses, deserted at night. It had 3 entrances, from Mitre Street from Duke Street, and from a narrow covered passage called Church Passage. A constable named Edward Watkins walked his beat through Mitre Square at regular intervals, approximately every 14 to 15 minutes. At 1:30 in the morning, he passed through the square and found it empty. At 1:44 he passed through again and found the body of Catherine Eddowes. She lay on her back in the southwest corner of the square, in the darkest spot, where the fog was thickest and the nearest lamp was furthest. Her throat had been cut. Her face had been mutilated beyond recognition. Her abdomen had been opened and her intestines extracted. Her kidney had been removed. The killer had performed all of this in approximately 10 minutes, in the interval between Watkins' 2 passages through the square, in darkness so complete that a man working by touch alone could accomplish what he could not accomplish by sight. The fog had served him perfectly. It had hidden him as he led Eddowes into Mitre Square. It had concealed him as he killed her. It had covered his escape through Church Passage or Duke Street or Mitre Street. No one knew which, because no one had seen him go. The constables and night watchmen who should have observed a man fleeing a murder scene observed nothing but fog, grey and impenetrable, offering no clues and no direction of pursuit. The double event, as it came to be called, demonstrated the killer's boldness and his reliance on the weather. He had been interrupted in Berner Street, prevented from completing his ritual by the arrival of Dimschutz and his cart. Rather than retreating, he had walked westward through the fog, found another victim within 45 minutes, and completed his work in Mitre Square. He had moved between 2 police jurisdictions, exploiting the lack of coordination between the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police. He had killed twice in one night, in 2 locations separated by nearly a mile, and he had escaped both times without being seen. The fog that night was described by witnesses as exceptionally thick. The rain had stopped, but the moisture it had left in the air had combined with the river mist and the coal smoke to produce visibility of only a few yards in some areas. The gas lamps were haloed in grey. The streets were silent. The constables moved through their beats like ghosts, hearing nothing, seeing nothing, arriving at murder scenes only after the murderer had gone. In the days that followed, the police received a communication that would become infamous. A postcard posted on October 1st mentioned the double event before the details had been published in the newspapers. It was signed Jack the Ripper. Whether the communication was genuine or a hoax remained debated for decades, but the name stuck. The killer had a name now, a title that captured the imagination of the public and the press. Jack the Ripper, the Phantom of the Fog, the Ghost of Whitechapel. The double event marked the peak of the terror. The women of the East End had known fear before, but now they knew something closer to panic. A man who could kill twice in one night, who could move through the fog with such impunity, who could escape the combined efforts of 2 police forces. Such a man seemed almost supernatural. A demon rather than a human being. The fog that had always been a nuisance became a source of dread. The nights that had always been dangerous became unbearable, and still the autumn continued, and still the fog descended, and still the darkness offered its protection to whoever wished to use it. The bodies of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were taken to their respective mortuaries. The inquests were held. The verdicts were murder by person or persons unknown. The police redoubled their efforts, flooding Whitechapel with constables and detectives, but the fog continued to defeat them. They could not see through it. They could not penetrate it. They could only walk through it, lanterns in hand, hoping to prevent another murder, knowing that hope was not enough. The night of the double event passed into history. The fog lifted with the morning. The streets dried in the weak autumn sun, and somewhere in London, the killer rested perhaps, or worked at whatever occupation concealed his true nature, waiting for the fog to return, waiting for the darkness to descend again, waiting for his next opportunity to demonstrate that no force of law could touch him in the grey. Chapter 8. The Silence Between Stones. Sound behaves strangely in fog. It does not travel as it should. It does not carry the distances that clear air permits. It becomes muffled, directionless, uncertain. A whisper where there should be a shout. A murmur where there should be a scream. The residents of Whitechapel knew this phenomenon intimately, though they could not have explained the physics that produced it. They knew that a voice raised in the fog seemed to die within yards of the mouth that uttered it. They knew that footsteps became ghostly impossible to locate, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They knew that the fog imposed a silence upon the streets that was different from the silence of a clear night, heavier, more oppressive, more absolute. The physics were simple enough for the natural philosophers of the age to understand. Sound travels through air as a wave, a compression and rarefaction of molecules that propagates outward from its source. In clear air, these waves travel efficiently, losing energy only gradually as they spread across distance. But in fog, the waves encounter obstacles, the countless tiny water droplets suspended in the air, each one a barrier that absorbs some of the wave's energy and scatters the rest in random directions. A sound that would carry 100 yards in clear air might carry only 20 yards in thick fog. A scream that would bring neighbours running might be heard only as a faint and distant moan, if it were heard at all. The killer understood this silence, whether through instinct or through careful observation. He chose his locations not only for their darkness, but for their acoustic isolation. The courts and yards surrounded by high walls, the passages that deadened sound, the corners where the fog pooled thickest, and the silence was most complete. He knew that a woman could cry out in these places and be heard by no one. He knew that the sounds of struggle, the gasp, the fall, the gurgle of a cut throat, would be absorbed by the fog before they reached any ear that might respond. He worked in silence because the fog gave him silence, and the silence gave him time. The women who died in the autumn of 1888 may have cried out. The evidence is uncertain. Some witnesses reported hearing sounds in the night, a word that might have been murder, a muffled shriek, a woman's voice saying no. But these reports were confused, contradictory, impossible to verify. The fog had swallowed whatever sounds the victims made, had diffused them into the grey until they became indistinguishable from the ordinary noises of the night. A cry that should have brought help brought nothing. A scream that should have woken neighbours woke no one. The victims died in a silence that was almost perfect, surrounded by hundreds of people who heard nothing at all. The silence extended beyond the immediate moment of murder. It affected the entire process of investigation. Constables who might have heard a disturbance and responded quickly heard nothing and continued their beats. Neighbours who might have looked out their windows at the sound of a struggle looked out at nothing, saw nothing, returned to their beds. The fog created a bubble of isolation around each murder scene, a zone of silence and blindness within which the killer could operate without fear of interruption. By the time anyone discovered what had happened, the killer was long gone, vanished into the same fog that had concealed his crimes. The testimony at the inquest revealed the extent of this acoustic isolation. Witness after witness described sleeping through the night undisturbed, hearing nothing unusual, waking only when the alarm was raised hours after the murder had occurred. The residents of Hanbury Street, where Annie Chapman died in the rear yard, heard nothing despite sleeping in rooms directly above the murder scene. The members of the International Working Men's Educational Club on Burner Street, where Elizabeth Stride died in Dutfield's yard, heard nothing despite being awake and active in the building just feet from where her throat was cut. The night watchman in Mitre Square heard nothing despite being stationed in a warehouse overlooking the spot where Catherine Eddowes was mutilated. The fog had silenced everything. This silence had a psychological effect on the residents of Whitechapel that compounded their fear. In ordinary circumstances, sound provided a measure of security. A woman walking home alone could take comfort in the voices she heard from nearby windows, the footsteps of other pedestrians, the distant rumble of carts on the main roads. These sounds indicated the presence of other human beings, potential witnesses, potential rescuers. But in the fog, these sounds disappeared. A woman walking home alone heard only her own footsteps, muffled and strange, and the vast silence of the grey. She could not tell if someone was following her. She could not tell if someone was waiting ahead. She walked in isolation so complete that she might have been the last person alive in the world. The constables experienced this isolation as acutely as anyone. A constable walking his beat on a foggy night heard nothing but his own breathing, his own boots on the cobblestones, the creak of his own leather belt. He could not hear his fellow constables on adjacent beats. He could not hear the whistles they might blow to summon assistance. He walked alone, surrounded by silence, knowing that if he encountered trouble, his calls for help might not be heard by anyone. This isolation bred caution. Constables moved slowly in the fog, reluctantly, unwilling to venture into the darkest passages where the silence was thickest. They stayed on the main streets where at least some sound could penetrate, where their whistles might reach friendly ears. They ceded the courts and alleys to the darkness. The killer exploited this caution. He knew that the constables would not follow him into the deepest silence. He knew that their reluctance to venture into the courts gave him sanctuary, gave him time to complete his work and escape before anyone came looking. He operated in the acoustic shadows of Whitechapel, the places where sound died and silence reigned, where a woman could scream and be heard by no one, where a man could kill and walk away undetected. The fog gave him this gift. The fog gave him silence so complete that his crimes became almost abstract, almost theoretical. Horrors that happened without sound, without witness, without any evidence except the bodies left behind. The silence between the stones of Whitechapel was not merely an absence of sound. It was a presence, a weight, a suffocation. It pressed against the ears like water. It made the pulse loud in the temples. It turned every shadow into a threat, every doorway into a potential hiding place, every corner into a possible ambush. The residents who lived through that autumn remembered the silence as vividly as they remembered the fog itself. They remembered lying in their beds, straining to hear anything at all, and hearing only the grey nothing of a city muffled by weather. They remembered the dread that came with that silence, the certainty that something terrible was happening just beyond the range of their ears, the helpless knowledge that they could do nothing to stop it. The technology of the age offered no remedy for this acoustic isolation. There were no telephones in the lodging houses of Whitechapel, no way to summon help quickly across distance. The police whistles that constables carried were designed to be heard across the open spaces of the city, but they were not designed for fog. Their piercing notes were absorbed by the moisture in the air scattered by the droplets, weakened until they became thin and directionless. A constable blowing his whistle in thick fog might be heard by another constable 50 feet away, or he might not be heard at all. The whistle was supposed to bring help running. In the fog it brought nothing but more silence. The press commented on this phenomenon in the weeks following the murders. The newspapers noted that residents of the affected areas had heard nothing unusual on the nights of the crimes, despite the violent nature of the attacks. They speculated about the speed with which the killer must have worked, about the possibility that he subdued his victims before they could cry out, about the chance that the women had gone willingly to their deaths. Trusting a man who seemed trustworthy until the moment he struck. All of these speculations may have contained some truth, but the simplest explanation was the fog. The fog had silenced the murders. The fog had made them inaudible. The fog had wrapped each crime in a blanket of grey quiet that no sound could penetrate. The autumn wore on, and the silence continued. The residents of Whitechapel learned to dread the foggy nights not only for what they might bring, but for how they would bring it. Silently, invisibly, without warning or alarm. They learned that the fog robbed them of their most basic defense, the ability to hear danger approaching and respond to it. They learned that in the fog, they were not merely blind, but deaf, isolated in a world of grey where anything could happen and no one would know. They lived in fear of the silence, the terrible silence that descended with the fog and lifted only when the fog lifted, leaving behind the bodies of women who had died without a sound. The stones of Whitechapel absorbed the silence and held it. The walls of the courts and alleys seemed to deaden sound even when the fog was gone, as though they had learned from the weather how to muffle and suppress. The residents spoke in low voices, as though afraid to disturb the quiet. The constables walked softly, as though the silence demanded respect. And somewhere in that silence, in the acoustic shadows of the East End, the memory of the murders lingered. The memory of women who had cried out and been heard by no one, who had died in a silence so complete that even history could not recover their final words. The fog would lift eventually. The silence would break. The sounds of ordinary life would return to the streets of Whitechapel, the cries of the costermongers, the rumble of the carts, the laughter from the public houses. But the memory of the silent nights remained. The memory of the fog and what it had hidden remained. The memory of the killer who had used the silence as his shield remained, long after the last body had been buried and the last inquest had concluded. The silence between the stones was never quite the same again. It carried echoes of that autumn, echoes that no amount of noise could fully drown out, echoes that whispered of murder in the grey. The night pressed close, the fog descended, and the silence wrapped itself around Whitechapel like a shroud, heavy and impenetrable, hiding whatever secrets the darkness contained. Somewhere in that silence, the killer moved. Somewhere in that silence, a woman walked unknowing toward her death. And somewhere in that silence, the constable strained to hear anything at all, and heard only the vast grey nothing of a city lost in fog. Chapter 9. The Weatherglass and the Hunt. The investigators who pursued the Whitechapel murderer were not fools. They were experienced men, professionals who had spent their careers studying the patterns of crime and the habits of criminals. They understood that murder was rarely random, that killers followed routines, that the circumstances of crimes often revealed as much as the physical evidence. And as the autumn of 1888 progressed, as the bodies accumulated and the public outcry grew more urgent, these investigators began to notice a pattern that no amount of police work could address. They began to notice the weather. The correlation was unmistakable to anyone who examined the dates and times of the murders alongside the meteorological records of the period. Mary Ann Nichols died on a night of thick fog. Annie Chapman died on a morning when the fog was so dense that witnesses could barely see across the yard where her body lay. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes died on a night when fog and rain combined to produce visibility of only a few yards. The killer struck when the weather favoured concealment. He struck when the fog was thickest, when the darkness was most complete, when the constables were most blind. This was not coincidence. This was method. The weatherglass, the barometer, was a common instrument in Victorian homes and offices. It measured atmospheric pressure, providing a rough prediction of coming weather. When the pressure dropped, rain and fog were likely. When the pressure rose, clear skies could be expected. Investigators had no need of a weatherglass to tell them what they already knew from direct observation, but the instrument provided a metaphor for their predicament. They were hunting a man whose movements were governed by forces beyond their control, forces as impersonal and unpredictable as the weather itself. They could not command the skies to clear. They could not order the fog to lift. They could only watch the weatherglass fall and know that somewhere in London, the killer was watching it too. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police both increased their patrols during periods of fog, reasoning that more constables on the streets would provide some deterrent effect, even if they could not see the crimes they were trying to prevent. The logic was sound in theory, but limited in practice. More constables meant more lanterns bobbing through the murk, more boots echoing on the cobblestones, more police presence in the general area. But the fog defeated numbers as surely as it defeated individual effort. 100 constables walking through Whitechapel on a foggy night were still 100 blind men, each isolated in his own bubble of grey, each unable to see what was happening beyond his immediate vicinity. The killer needed only to wait until a constable passed, then strike in the interval before the next constable arrived. The increased patrols may have made his work slightly more difficult, but they did not make it impossible. The newspapers seized upon the weather connection with enthusiasm. The press coverage of the Whitechapel murders was extensive, detailed, and often sensational, and the observation that the killer seemed to choose foggy nights provided excellent copy. Headlines warned residents to stay indoors when the fog descended. Editorials demanded that the police do something about the weather, as though it were a matter of municipal administration rather than natural phenomenon. Cartoons depicted the fog as an accomplice to murder, a grey figure with malevolent eyes wrapping itself around the streets of the East End. The public imagination transformed the fog from a nuisance into a villain, from an inconvenience into an active agent of evil. This transformation was not entirely irrational. The fog did serve the killer's purposes. It did provide him with concealment and escape. It did create the conditions under which murder could occur undetected. To personify the fog, to treat it as an enemy, was to acknowledge a truth that the investigators understood but could not overcome. They were fighting not only a man but an environment. They were hunting in a landscape that actively hindered their efforts, that seemed designed to frustrate detection and facilitate crime. The fog was not neutral. The fog was on the killer's side. The investigators responded to this disadvantage with various strategies, none of which proved effective. They stationed constables at fixed points rather than having them walk continuous beats, reasoning that a stationary observer might notice more than a moving one. They coordinated their movements to ensure that multiple constables would be in the same area at the same time, hoping that collective observation might succeed where individual observation failed. They deployed plainclothes detectives to mingle with the crowds, to watch for suspicious behaviour, to identify potential victims before they could be attacked. They even, according to some accounts, dressed male constables as women in the hope of luring the killer into a trap. All of these strategies failed. The fog defeated them all. The detectives who worked the case left behind records of their frustration. They described the feeling of impotence that came with walking through streets where they could see nothing, hear nothing, detect nothing. They described the long nights of fruitless patrol, the endless hours of waiting for something to happen, the crushing disappointment of arriving at a murder scene only to find that the killer had vanished into the grey. They described the public pressure, the demands from their superiors, the accusations in the press that they were incompetent or corrupt or both. They were doing everything they could, but everything they could was not enough. The weather was against them. The correlation between fog and murder raised questions that the investigators could not answer. Did the killer plan his attacks in advance, watching the weather and waiting for the right conditions? Or did he act impulsively, taking advantage of foggy nights when they happened to occur? Did he have a schedule, a pattern, a method that could be predicted and intercepted? Or was he simply an opportunist, striking whenever circumstances permitted? The investigators debated these questions endlessly, constructing theories, testing hypotheses, searching for any insight that might give them an advantage. But the fog kept its secrets, and the killer kept his. The weatherglass became a symbol of the hunt's futility. Investigators could predict when the fog would come, but they could not prevent it. They could anticipate the conditions that favoured murder, but they could not change those conditions. They could deploy their constables and their detectives and their elaborate strategies, but they could not make the fog any less thick, the darkness any less complete, the streets any less dangerous. The weatherglass told them what they already knew, that the nights were growing colder, the fog more frequent, the autumn deeper. It told them that the killer's window of opportunity was widening even as their own chances of catching him narrowed. The hunt continued through October and into November, through fog after fog, through night after night of fruitless patrol. The investigators followed leads that proved worthless. They arrested suspects who were later released. They interviewed witnesses whose testimony contradicted other witnesses. They accumulated evidence that pointed in every direction and no direction, that suggested 100 different killers and no killer at all. The fog obscured not only the crimes but the investigation, wrapping everything in a grey uncertainty that made certainty impossible. The weather glass in the police stations rose and fell with the changing pressure. The constables watched it, knowing that a falling barometer meant another night of fog, another night of blindness, another night of waiting for the killer to strike. They prepared for their shifts with a resignation that bordered on despair. They checked their lanterns, knowing the lanterns would be useless. They strapped on their whistles, knowing the whistles might not be heard. They walked out into the fog, knowing they would see nothing, hear nothing, accomplish nothing except the completion of their assigned rounds. And still the fog came. It rolled up from the Thames in the early evening hours. It thickened as the night progressed. It wrapped the streets of Whitechapel in its grey embrace and held them until morning. The investigators watched the weather glass and knew what was coming. The women of the streets watched the sky and knew what was coming. The killer, wherever he was, watched the weather and knew that his time was approaching. The hunt continued, but the hunt was losing. The fog was winning. The autumn deepened. The days grew shorter. The nights grew longer and darker and more dangerous. The weather glass fell again and again, predicting fog, predicting darkness, predicting the conditions under which murder could occur. The investigators did what they could. They were not fools. They were professionals doing their best in impossible circumstances, but they were fighting the weather as much as they were fighting the killer, and the weather could not be arrested, could not be interrogated, could not be brought to justice. The weather simply descended night after night, protecting the man who used it as his shield. The hunt would continue for weeks, for months, for years in some sense. The case would never be officially closed. The killer would never be officially identified. The fog would lift eventually, and the murders would cease, but the questions would remain, hanging in the air like mist that refused to dissipate. Who was he? How did he escape? Why did he stop? The weather glass could not answer these questions. The investigators could not answer them. The fog kept its secrets then, and it keeps them still. Chapter 10. The fog lifts, the killer fades. The last of the canonical 5 died on the 9th of November, 1888. Mary Jane Kelly was younger than the others, only 25 years old, and she died not in the streets but in her own room, a small chamber in Miller's Court that she rented for 4 shillings a week. The circumstances of her death were different from those that had come before. She was indoors behind a locked door in a space that should have been private and safe, but she was not safe. No woman in Whitechapel was safe that autumn, and the walls of her room provided no more protection than the fog-shrouded streets had provided to the others. The night of November 8th was cold but relatively clear. The fog that had blanketed Whitechapel through much of October had thinned, replaced by the sharper chill of approaching winter. The weather glass was rising. The skies were darker but more transparent. The stars visible for the first time in weeks. The gas lamps casting their light in clear circles rather than diffused halos. The conditions that had favoured the killer's previous work were changing. The long foggy autumn was coming to an end. Mary Jane Kelly was seen alive at various times during the evening and night. Witnesses placed her in the public houses of the neighbourhood, drinking, singing, apparently unconcerned about the dangers that stalked the streets. She was seen with a man near her lodgings at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, though the witnesses disagreed about his appearance and manner. She was heard singing in her room at a later hour, her voice carrying through the thin walls of Miller's Court. And then she was silent, and no one thought to check on her, and the night passed without alarm. The discovery came at 11:15 in the morning, when Thomas Bowyer, sent by the landlord to collect overdue rent, knocked on Kelly's door and received no answer. He reached through a broken window pane, pushed aside the curtain, and looked into the room. What he saw sent him stumbling back into the court, unable to speak, barely able to stand. The body on the bed was scarcely recognizable as human. The killer had had hours to work, hours of privacy behind a locked door, and he had used those hours to inflict mutilation so extreme that the photographs taken at the scene would be suppressed for decades. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly was the most savage of the canonical five, but it was also the last. After November 9th, the killings stopped. The fog returned in the weeks that followed, thick and impenetrable as ever, but no more bodies appeared in the courts and alleys of Whitechapel. The constables walked their beats through the grey, their lanterns held before them, their nerves stretched tight, waiting for another scream that never came. The women of the streets continued their desperate work, glancing over their shoulders, flinching at shadows, but the shadows held nothing. The killer had vanished. The reasons for his disappearance remained as mysterious as his identity. Had he died? Had he been imprisoned for some other crime? Had he emigrated, fled to another city, another country, another life? Had he simply stopped, satisfied with what he had done, or frightened by the intensity of the hunt, or prevented by circumstances that history would never uncover? The theories multiplied in the years that followed. Suspects were named and investigated and discarded. Books were written, arguments advanced, evidence marshalled for 100 different conclusions, but no definitive answer emerged. The killer faded into the fog from which he had come, leaving behind only questions and bodies, and the memory of an autumn when London had learned to fear the dark. The fog itself continued to descend upon the city through that winter and the winters that followed. It would continue for decades, the famous London fog, the pea souper that choked the streets and filled the lungs and turned the greatest city in the world into a maze of grey. But the fog was never again associated with murder in quite the same way. The Whitechapel killings became historical, legendary, a chapter in the city's past rather than a present danger. The fog became once again what it had been before, a nuisance, an inconvenience, a subject for complaint rather than terror. The association between weather and murder faded from public consciousness, replaced by other fears, other dangers, other headlines. The residents of Whitechapel slowly returned to their ordinary lives. The women who work the streets continue to work them, driven by the same poverty that had driven them before. The lodging houses filled and emptied with their transient populations. The public houses served their beer and gin. The costermongers pushed their barrows through the lanes. Life went on, as life always does, even in the shadow of atrocity. The murders became stories to tell, warnings to heed, lessons to remember. They became part of the folklore of the East End, part of the collective memory of a neighbourhood that had seen horrors and survived them. The police never closed the case. Officially, the Whitechapel murders remained unsolved, a file that gathered dust in the archives, a mystery that no amount of investigation could penetrate. The detectives who had worked the case moved on to other crimes, other investigations, other failures and successes. Some of them wrote memoirs in their later years, offering their theories about the killer's identity, their frustrations with the investigation, their memories of that terrible autumn. None of them claimed certainty. None of them knew the truth. The fog had hidden the killer too well, and the passage of time had hidden him further still. The years passed. The 19th century gave way to the 20th. London changed, grew, modernised. The coal fires that had produced the fog were gradually replaced by cleaner fuels. The gas lamps were replaced by electric lights. The narrow courts and alleys of Whitechapel were demolished and rebuilt, their geography transformed beyond recognition. The world that had made the murders possible disappeared, brick by brick, street by street, until nothing remained but photographs and maps and the written testimony of those who had been there. The fog itself grew thinner and less frequent as the air grew cleaner, until the great fogs of the Victorian era became memories, curiosities, subjects for historical study rather than lived experience. But the mystery remained. The question of who killed those 5 women in the autumn of 1888 remained unanswered, as it remains unanswered today. The fog that had protected the killer in life continued to protect him in death, obscuring his identity as thoroughly as it had obscured his movements through the streets of Whitechapel. He became a legend, a phantom, a figure of nightmare and fascination. He became Jack the Ripper, a name that resonated through the decades, a name that still evokes the gaslit streets and foggy nights of a vanished London. The last chapter of the story has no resolution, because the story has no resolution. It ends not with justice, but with silence, not with answers, but with questions, not with the capture of a killer, but with his disappearance into the grey. The fog lifted, and the killer was gone. The streets cleared, and no one knew where he had gone or why. The autumn ended, and the winter came, and the world moved on, and the mystery remained, floating in the historical consciousness like mist that refuses to dissipate. The candle burned low in the windows of Whitechapel. The fire died in the grate. The fog thinned with the approach of dawn, revealing streets that were empty, quiet, ordinary. The women who had died were buried in paupers' graves, their names recorded in official documents, but otherwise forgotten by a city that had too many dead to mourn them all. The constables completed their shifts and went home to their families. The detectives filed their reports and moved on to other cases. The journalists wrote their final articles and turned their attention to other sensations. The world forgot, as the world always forgets, until only the story remained. And the story endures. It endures in the books and articles and documentaries that continue to appear. Year after year, each one promising new evidence, new theories, new solutions to an unsolvable mystery. It endures in the tours that guide visitors through the streets where the murders occurred, pointing out locations that no longer exist, describing events that no one alive witnessed. It endures in the imagination, where the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London remain eternally dark, eternally dangerous, eternally haunted by a figure in a cape and top hat who may never have existed in quite that form. The fog protected Jack the Ripper in life. History has protected him in death. The mystery that began in the grey streets of Whitechapel continues in the grey uncertainties of historical inquiry, where evidence is fragmentary, testimony is contradictory, and truth remains forever just out of reach. The killer escaped into the fog, and the fog never gave him back. He remains there still, in some sense, a shadow in the grey, a whisper in the silence, a question that will never be answered. The night grew quiet. The fog dissolved into the morning light. The streets of Whitechapel emerged from the grey, ordinary and unremarkable, bearing no trace of the horrors they had witnessed. The residents woke and began their days, grateful for the light, relieved by the absence of news. Another night had passed without murder. Another morning had come without discovery. The autumn of terror was over, though no one knew it yet. The killer had faded. The fog had lifted, and history once again turned the page in the dark. The candle guttered and went out. The chamber fell silent. And somewhere in the vast archive of unanswered questions, the Whitechapel murders took their place alongside all the other mysteries that time has failed to solve, waiting, perhaps, for a future that will never come, for evidence that will never surface, for a truth that remains hidden in the fog. Epilogue: the grey that remains. The years passed over Whitechapel like fog passing over water, slow and silent and transforming everything they touched. The 19th century drew to its close, and the 20th century began, and the world that had witnessed the autumn of terror receded into memory, into legend, into the amber of historical preservation. The streets remained for a time. The buildings remained. The courts and alleys where women had died remained, though their names were spoken less and less frequently, though the residents who had known those women grew old and died, and were replaced by others who knew only the stories. The fog continued to descend upon London in the winters that followed 1888. It rolled up from the Thames as it had always done, mingled with the coal smoke as it had always done, wrapped the city in its grey embrace as it had always done. But the fog was no longer the same. It was no longer the accomplice to murder that it had been during those terrible months. It was simply weather again, an inconvenience, a characteristic of the city that residents complained about and visitors remarked upon. The association between fog and fear faded with the passing years, replaced by the ordinary annoyances of limited visibility and soiled clothing, and the persistent cough that came with breathing the damp and smoky air. The police files on the Whitechapel murders were never closed, but they were set aside, relegated to the archives where cold cases gathered dust and waited for attention that would never come. The detectives who had worked the investigation moved on to other matters, other crimes, other frustrations. Some of them retired, some of them died. A few wrote memoirs in their later years, offering their recollections of the case, their theories about the killer's identity, their justifications for the failure to catch him. These memoirs were read with interest by a public that remained fascinated by the mystery, but they provided no answers, no resolution, no name that could be attached with certainty to the crimes. The women who had died were buried and largely forgotten. Mary Ann Nichols lay in Ilford Cemetery, her grave unmarked for many years, her memory preserved only in the official records of the inquest and the newspaper accounts that had reported her death. Annie Chapman was buried in Manor Park Cemetery, her funeral attended by her family and a crowd of curious onlookers who had come to witness the interment of a murder victim. Elizabeth Stride was buried in the East London Cemetery, far from the Swedish homeland she had left decades before. Catherine Eddowes was buried in the City of London Cemetery, her grave eventually marked with a stone that recorded her name and the date of her death. Mary Jane Kelly was buried in Leytonstone, her funeral paid for by the verger of the church where she had sometimes worshipped, her grave visited by reporters and sensation seekers who hoped to find some meaning in the place where her body lay. These graves became sites of pilgrimage in the years and decades that followed, visited by those who sought to connect with the tragedy, to stand in the presence of the dead, to feel some echo of the horror that had ended in these quiet plots of earth. The headstones weathered and cracked, the inscriptions faded, the flowers that visitors left wilted and were replaced by other flowers, which wilted in turn. The dead remained silent as the dead always remain, offering no answers to the questions that the living continued to ask. The streets of Whitechapel changed slowly at first, then more rapidly as the 20th century progressed. The lodging houses where the victims had sought their fourpenny beds were condemned and demolished, replaced by newer buildings that housed different populations with different needs. The courts and alleys where the murders had occurred were absorbed into larger developments, their names erased from maps, their geography transformed beyond recognition. Bucks Row became Durwood Street. Hanbury Street survived but was rebuilt. Berner Street was renamed Henriques Street. Mitre Square remained, a small open space in the City of London, but the warehouses that had surrounded it were replaced by modern offices, and the corner where Catherine Eddowes had died was paved over and forgotten. Miller's Court, where Mary Jane Kelly had met her end, was demolished in the 1920s. The cramped rooms and narrow passage swept away to make room for a warehouse that would itself be demolished decades later. Nothing remained of the place where the most savage of the murders had occurred. Nothing except photographs and sketches and the written descriptions of those who had seen the scene before it was cleaned and dismantled. The room where Kelly had died existed now only in the historical record, a ghost of a place haunting a geography that no longer corresponded to any physical reality. The fog began to lift in the middle of the 20th century, not metaphorically but literally. The Clean Air Acts of the 1950s and 60s restricted the burning of coal in London, and the great fogs that had characterised the city for centuries began to diminish. The last of the true pea supers, the killing fogs that had claimed thousands of lives through respiratory illness, occurred in 1952, when a 4-day fog blanketed London and caused an estimated 12,000 deaths. After that, the fogs grew thinner, less frequent, less deadly. The air grew cleaner. The skies grew clearer. The city that had been synonymous with fog became a city where fog was rare, a memory, a historical curiosity. This clearing of the air had the curious effect of making the Whitechapel murders seem even more distant, even more alien, even more like events from another world. The fog that had protected the killer had been a specific phenomenon, a product of specific conditions that no longer existed. The London of the late 20th and early 21st centuries was not the London of 1888. The streets were lit by electricity, bright and constant. The air was breathable, transparent. The courts and alleys had been replaced by housing estates and office blocks. The world in which Jack the Ripper had operated had vanished as completely as the man himself, leaving behind only traces, fragments, echoes. And yet the fascination endured. The mystery of the Whitechapel murders continued to attract attention, to generate theories, to inspire books and films and documentaries and walking tours. The figure of Jack the Ripper became embedded in popular culture, a symbol of Victorian horror, a character in countless works of fiction, a name that evoked gaslit streets and foggy nights even for those who had never experienced either. The killer who had escaped into the fog achieved a kind of immortality through his escape, becoming more famous in death than he could ever have been in life, becoming a legend that grew larger with each passing decade. The theories about his identity multiplied beyond counting. He was a doctor, a butcher, a midwife, a sailor. He was a member of the royal family, a prominent artist, a Polish immigrant, an American quack. He was a single killer, or a pair of killers, or a conspiracy of killers. He was mad or he was sane. He was clever or he was lucky. He was a sexual predator or a religious fanatic or a man with a grudge against prostitutes. Every few years, a new book appeared claiming to have solved the mystery, offering new evidence, new analysis, new certainty. And every few years, the new certainty was challenged, disputed, discarded, replaced by another certainty that would prove equally fragile. The truth was that no one knew. No one had ever known. The fog that had hidden the killer in 1888 continued to hide him in the 21st century, not as weather but as absence, as the simple lack of evidence that would have been necessary to identify him with confidence. The witnesses had seen only shapes in the grey. The police had found only bodies and questions. The killer had left no confession, no memoir, no deathbed revelation that could be verified and accepted. He had vanished into history as completely as he had vanished into the fog, and history, like the fog, kept its secrets. The descendants of those who had lived through the Autumn of Terror were scattered now across the world, carrying in their blood the memory of ancestors who had walked those dark streets, who had known the fear, who had perhaps passed the killer on a foggy night without knowing what they had passed. These descendants knew nothing of their connection to the events, felt nothing of the terror that their great-great-grandparents had felt. The living always move forward, away from the past, toward futures that the dead cannot imagine. The thread of memory grows thin and breaks, and the past becomes not memory but history, not experience but story. The story of Jack the Ripper endures because it has no ending. It endures because the mystery remains unsolved, because the questions remain unanswered, because the human mind cannot rest easy with uncertainty and returns again and again to puzzles it cannot solve. It endures because the fog that protected the killer in life continues to protect him in death, wrapping his identity in a grey obscurity that no amount of investigation can penetrate. It endures because some secrets are never revealed, because some crimes are never punished, because some killers escape not only justice but identification, slipping through the fingers of history as easily as they slipped through the fingers of the police. The nights are quiet now in what was once Whitechapel. The streets are lit. The air is clear. The fog that once descended nightly has become a rare occurrence, a nostalgic reminder of a city that no longer exists. The women who walk those streets walk in relative safety, protected by lights and cameras and the presence of a population that no longer tolerates the darkness that once prevailed. The courts, and alleys are gone. The lodging houses are gone. The world of 1888 is gone. Preserved only in photographs and documents and the stories that continue to be told. But the grey remains in a sense. It remains in the uncertainty that surrounds the case, in the questions that cannot be answered, in the identity that cannot be established. It remains in the fog of history that obscures the past from the present, that makes the truth inaccessible, that transforms events into legends and legends into myths. It remains in the imagination, where the streets of Whitechapel are forever dark, forever dangerous, forever haunted by a figure who emerges from the grey and returns to it, leaving nothing behind but blood and mystery. The Bedside Historian has walked with you through those streets tonight. Together we have descended into the fog, have felt its damp embrace, have strained to see through its grey curtain. We have heard the silence that it imposed, have felt the blindness that it created, have understood, perhaps, why a killer could operate with such impunity in a city of millions. We have followed the evidence as far as it leads, and we have stopped where it stops at the edge of the grey, at the boundary beyond which certainty cannot pass. The hour grows late. The story is told. The fog that we have conjured in imagination begins to thin, to dissolve, to release us back into the world of the present. The streets of your own city wait outside your window, lit and safe and ordinary. The night that surrounds you is not the night of 1888. The darkness that you know is not the darkness that the women of Whitechapel knew. You are safe. You are warm. You are far from the grey streets where murder walked unhindered. Sleep now, if sleep will come. Let the images fade. Let the fog lift from your mind as it lifted from London. Let the silence of the night wrap around you, not as a threat but as a comfort, not as concealment but as peace. The story is over. The mystery remains. And somewhere in the vast archive of history, the Whitechapel murders rest in their grey obscurity, waiting for answers that may never come, waiting for a truth that remains hidden in the fog. The candle has burned down to nothing. The wick gutters in its pool of wax. The flame flickers once, twice, and then surrenders to the dark. The chamber falls silent. The night settles into stillness. And history, patient and implacable, turns another page in the endless book of the past, recording what can be recorded, preserving what can be preserved, and leaving the rest to the grey that remains. Good night. Sleep well. The fog has lifted, and the Bedside Historian will be waiting when next you need a voice in the dark, ready to whisper another truth from the shadows of time.